Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar on Leading in Uncertainty and Complexity. I'm David Woodshale, Director of Marketing and Communications at Amber and BGA. In our ever-changing world, we can often find ourselves feeling paralyzed by uncertainty. So today, I'm delighted to be joined by Stephen D'Souza, international executive educator, consultant, coach, speaker, and best-selling author of 5 leadership and management books, including the award-winning Not Knowing. He's joining us today to offer an interactive Not Knowing masterclass, which will focus on how to lead yourself and others effectively in volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. This is a vital skill in the 21st century, and we want you to feel comfortable in the unknown. We also want this session to be as interactive as possible. So if you've got any questions at all, then just add them to the question box and we'll get through as many as we can before the end of the session. And if you miss anything, don't worry, because we'll share the full presentation with you all within about a week. So that's all for me. Without further ado, Stephen.
Thank you, David, and thank you everybody for joining the webinar or listening to the recording post the event. I'd like to start by just congratulating you for investing your time in participating on listening. This is one of my favorite quotes, and essentially it says knowledge is a commodity. Like any other commodity, it can become outdated. So your investment in your own learning and your own development, I think, says a lot about helping you stay relevant in terms of our changing times where ambiguity and complexity is increasing. So firstly, congratulations on being here, and I hope this is a valuable use of your time. A few words about me more personally, less professionally. My mother's from a place called Goa, India. My father was born in Kenya, very different environment. I've lived and born in London, worked in Madrid in Spain, and lived a couple of years in Romania in Bucharest. So bring that kind of geography into my work. I'm actually speaking now to you all from Dubai, working with leaders from Iran. I have trained as a priest. I've worked in prisons, in hospices, in deaf centers. I was a group HR manager for a hotel chain in London. And I worked in an investment bank and a private bank, heading diversity and inclusion and within leadership, talent management. When I was in my last career in finance, I became curious about people from different cultures and industries doing interesting things with their lives. And I wrote my first book called Made in Britain, telling their life stories, whether that was a CEO of a beer company, Cobra Beer, the designer of the Nobel Peace Prize building, David Adjaye, award-winning architect, or Angela Lamar, one of the first female African comedians on the BBC broadcaster. Wrote a second book on networking, how do people grow and leverage their personal and professional networks for success. Third book on Not Knowing, which is really the theme of today's webinar, which is how do we lead in uncertainty. Fourth book on Not Doing, which is about sustainable leadership. As executives, how do we prevent acting by pushing and pulling too much, but working with systems and flow. So this is on sustainable leadership. And just out is the final book of that trilogy, and it looks at identity. How do we move beyond this disconnected, atomized individual that we're always trying to protect, defend, extend, to recognizing our deep entanglement and interconnection with each other, and more importantly, with the natural world. So hopefully you got some sense of my background. I work globally with different organizations. So although I have an academic background, what I'm going to speak today hopefully will not put you to sleep and will be interactive, and you can participate in the chat. Well, hopefully as you're listening to the recording, you can still be thinking about some of the questions that we'll pose throughout. What I aim to do in this session is look at the idea of what do I mean by not knowing? Think about how it might relate to your current challenges, space for discussion, questions as much as we can on the webinar, and I'll ask David to call out some of the things that you enter into the chat. So thank you for participating and being actively engaged. Essentially, if I was to sum it up in a sentence, we're looking at how might we face the unknown, not as a place of uncertainty, but as a space of opportunity and potentially even excitement and possibility. Please share actively in the chat, and I encourage you to participate fully. You can share anonymously if you wish. Ask that if people do disclose anything regarding their companies or their personal, that it's kept confidential and that it isn't discussed outside, just what you learn. Real examples on how you've tackled them. So one of my favorite phrases is wisdom is shared. And that's the best thing. If you can keep, I've mentioned here, micro journal. All I mean by that is it helps to take short notes that will help you throughout as we work on a particular case that you wish to apply some of these ideas to. And there won't be any bullet points or things like this, but what I will do is offer you questions to reflect on and to live with, and maybe experiments you could try. So I ask you to come with that mind of a beginner's mind, freshness and openness. What can I learn here? What can I learn from this webinar today? So in the chat, I'd like to start by inviting you to think about, where are you experiencing the unknown right now? It might be in your role, responsibility, changes in your career, procedures, clients, lots of things happening at the macro level, but taking it down to your level, the micro, your personal level, where are you experiencing the unknown right now? Just get a sense of what's in the room from the listeners. Can you enter into the chat, where are you experiencing the unknown? And I'll ask David to call out a few things that have been entered in the next few seconds. So just enter in, where are you experiencing the unknown? Where are you feeling that? And if you want to say personally, it's fine. Although this is, we're geared towards leadership and management, it's an area that touches across all spheres of our life. So please do feel free to enter wherever that domain is.
Okay, we've got quite a few things coming through, Stephen. So some people are saying new roles, promotions and career changes, not knowing which direction to take in terms of their current job and professional career, mergers and transitions, climate change. Someone here says they live in the Ukraine. New organization, bad infrastructure in the organization, considering going self-employed, querying their own purpose in their role, market levels highly fluctuating, personal levels having to pivot and adapt to changing organizational directions, instability within their own country, the recruitment market, working within the energy sector, which is obviously in transition at the moment. Lots and lots of things coming through. Russia is coming through again, currency changes, hybrid working.
Yeah, thank you. And you can see from the answers, there are things at the macro level, political level. There are things also in the organizational level, and also things at the personal level. But what is clear is that the unknown is endemic. There isn't an area of our lives that we won't face at some point, the unknown. And I'm hoping that you'll get the chance today to focus on one specific area, and hopefully within your circle of influence, but one area, and that will hopefully look at how can we apply what we're learning today to that specific thing. So thank you for sharing those, and obviously feeling for those who are experiencing the discomfort of not knowing, which I do want to pay serious attention to, as well as share how we might think about it differently too. I want to start by just saying that we live in a society that does privilege knowledge, and it privileges the known, privileges specifically expertise. And that's a good thing, because it allows us to make advances and allows us to make progress in fields such as medicine, science, technology. But where it can go wrong is when we overemphasize expertise and undervalue curiosity. So when Friedrich Hayek accepted the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1976, he entitled his winner's speech, "The Pretense of Knowledge," and he warned against economic omniscience, the idea that economic theory could solve every issue. When I don't know if many of you have read the book The Black Swan by Nicholas Taleb, but he also talks about this danger of, and in this particular case, he talked about forecasters, and he said, never trust the forecast of somebody wearing a tie. So specifically, I didn't wear a tie, if you can see me on this webinar. But the idea behind this is that when we listen to experts, we can somehow devolve our own responsibility for thinking critically. Actually, Norina Hurt, she wrote a book called Mind Wide Open. I think she's at Cambridge. And her studies on neuroscans of the brain showed when people listen to experts, it's as if the independent decision-making part of their brain shuts down. Like they just listen without critically thinking for themselves. So it's not necessarily something I'm saying is negative. I'm just saying that we need to be aware of the pitfalls of putting overconfidence in our experts, and being able to think critically and reclaim our own abilities, and also not overemphasizing this blind belief in expertise, and balancing that with tempering our confidence and avoiding overconfidence. Another example is from the field of medicine. Estimated that 1 in 6 medical diagnosis is inaccurate. That's between 17 and 29 billion US dollars the Institute of Medicine estimates is wasted on inaccurate or unnecessary patient treatment that results in 1 in 20 hospital deaths. So whereas that we do have, valuable service, we need to also recognize the almost like the limitations of our knowledge. Another example is in the world of finance. You can remember the financial crash of 2008. When that happened, the Queen visited the London School of Economics, and she came in November and she asked the question, if all of you were so clever, why did nobody notice that the credit crunch was on its way? The British Academy decided to address that question head on. So in June of 2009, it invited different people from academics, regulators, experts to answer the Queen and that question, why did it happen? And in July 2009, they wrote a letter to her. And actually in the letter, it said, actually people did know it was happening. Financial stability quarterly reports pointed towards a financial shock. One global bank had 4,000 risk managers. They said the problem wasn't that we didn't know. The problem was that there was an overconfidence in the belief in a few people who knew what they thought they knew what was happening. So Alan Greenspan, when he writes about this, he titled it Irrational Exuberance. He said he's never seen a greater example of wishful thinking combined with hubris. Nobody was confident enough to say that they didn't understand the complex financial instruments, and they had this belief that others would. Now, when we acknowledge our limitations, it becomes very clear that it's impossible that anybody can know all the things that we need to. For example, in chess, take a grandmaster. As of, I think, a couple of years ago, there were 1,441 chess grandmasters, people with high cognitive abilities, yet on average, they can think around 15 moves ahead. And that's a game with fixed and predictable rules. Now imagine that we're operating in markets and in global markets where there are millions of actors acting predictably and unpredictably, rationally and irrationally. It's impossible that anybody can have all the answers. In fact, Daniel Kahneman, who wrote Thinking Fast, Slow, says he points to, I think it's over 150 unconscious biases, from primacy bias, remembering the first thing, recency, the last thing, confirmation bias, remembering only what confirms our existing beliefs. He says, if you think you have reasons for your beliefs, you're probably mistaken. And by that, he was pointing to too many factors that can determine how we think, that are beyond our conscious control. Now, given that it's impossible to know, the 3 most feared words, I would say, in the business environment and in many other environments are, I don't know. Speaking with the CEO of a large beverage company in the Netherlands, next day he was going to speak to his top 500 leaders. And he said to me, Stephen, I don't know what's going to happen, but if I say I don't know, immediately I'll be deauthorized, I'll lose my credibility. The fact is, he didn't exactly know. So this is the crux. What I'm going to do, though, is going to reframe this not knowing in the next few minutes from something negative to something that's really valuable and can help us in our careers. But I'd like you to choose something specifically. So in the beginning, I got you to brainstorm areas of your life where you're experiencing the unknown. Could you choose one that you want to work with in this webinar today? You don't need to write it into the chat, but just have something in your mind that as we start to talk about ideas, you can apply these actions to your specific situation. So just choose one, maybe keep it on your piece of paper and apply what we're going to be talking about to that situation. Now, one of the ways that we can think about not knowing is being in the dark. And often it's used in a pejorative way. Someone's in the dark, they don't know. But what I'm saying, my hypothesis is that being in the dark is positive. Being in not knowing is positive because it allows us to avoid hubris. This false irrational that we think it is when it isn't the case. It avoids overconfidence. So it avoids, confidence isn't the issue, overconfidence is the issue. Moreover, it allows us to take responsibility, because once we admit and once we can acknowledge that we don't know, we can take action in the face of that. When I use the metaphor, light and dark, we can also think about night and day. And whereas we privilege the light, they're half-half, they're 50-50. And when we think about change, we think about transformation. Mostly all change, all transformation, whether it's the seed in the earth, whether it's the baby in the womb, happens in the darkness. When you think nothing's happening, when things look a bit more difficult, that's the point of change, and that's the foundation, really, transformation. So I'd like you to just to reframe in your mind that not knowing can be positive, and that there's a value in the darkness. And that's why on the cover of our book, Deanna and I chose darkness shining in light. And it's from the analyst, Bion, who was a famous psychoanalyst. His phrase was, darkness illuminates. So it makes things visible. Now, when I'm speaking about not knowing, let me be clear. I'm not speaking about not knowing for simple challenges. So if I have a simple problem, I need information, for example, I go to a search engine, seek a source of that information, speak to a person. So it's not about simple issues. Now, it's also not about complicated issues. So this is the buttons on a train toilet door photographed for you. So you can see it open and close. That's simple. This is a slightly more complicated, right? Is the door open, close? I'm not quite sure. Now, the problems we face that you've also listed, many of them, are not only simple, they're not only complicated, but they're complex and they're chaotic. And what we need to do is recognize that the tools for addressing complex challenges are far different than the tools that were needed for simple or complicated challenges. Another example to give you is, for example, the Ferrari, very complicated piece of high-tech machinery, like a vehicle, but somebody can disassemble and reassemble it. Whereas you can't necessarily do that for, let's say, a rainforest with so many variables regulating temperature, weather conditions, and soil. It's a complex challenge. Now, we're not just facing complex challenge, we're facing chaotic. Well, pictures, let's say, if our recent example of a global pandemic with new variants that happen occasionally and spread. So it's we need to acknowledge what is the type of problem and what do we need to do in order to solve that. Now, if you want to read more around this categorization of simple, complicated, complex, chaotic, there's a framework. It's called the Cynefin framework. Some of you have heard of, and the author of that framework originator is called David Snowden. This is worth diving into if you want to do some further research after this. What Deanna and I discovered was that when people are at the edge of their knowledge, it can be a terrifying place. And when we're facing the unknown, it's almost like a somatic experience. It's not just in our head, it's in our bodies, in our hearts, in our feelings. And we use the metaphor of the edge to describe this, and specifically a coastal town in the edge of Spain called Finisterre. So there's an ancient pilgrimage called the Camino De Santiago. People have traveled for centuries, and from France to the town of Santiago to Compostela, and then 90 kilometers more to the coastal town of Finisterre. Now, Finisterre in Latin means the end of the earth. And when sailors went off on this coastal town, they didn't often return. So in the maps and the old cartographers, they would draw serpents, dragons, lions, because they literally found it terrifying. And that when we're at the edge, we're not sure, how will I be in my new job? Or should I make this decision? What will happen with this change? What will happen? Mentioned macro politics. It can feel terrifying. Now, we all react in different ways at the edge. And these were some of the common reactions that people experience at the edge. So the first one you can see is control. We try to control the situation, maybe put more rules, regulations, maybe more management, micromanagement, ways to control. But it can also happen in other ways. I remember buying a house in London, and the vendor who was selling me a house, she wasn't able to complete by a certain date, and I was getting worried. It was coming near the date, and if I didn't have a new home, I'd be homeless. So I said to the estate agent, if she's not able to complete by this date, I'm going to withdraw from the purchase. The estate agent said to me, Stephen, could you remain a little longer in this uncertainty? I never received sage advice from an estate agent before, but in this case, it was. I remained a bit longer and completed. But do you see that me saying, if it's not able to complete by this date, I'll withdraw, was my way of taking back control in the ambiguity, the uncertainty. The second top and the middle image is resignation, passivity, defeat. No, I can't do this. Nothing will happen. Nothing changes anyway. It's feeling like that feeling of passivity and defeat. The top right image is called paralysis by analysis. No, this is when we are facing the unknown and we get in the consultants. Let's say we bring in McKinsey, or we do the spreadsheets, but by the time that we've got the data, the situation has changed. The bottom left-hand image, Homer, I call catastrophic thinking. This is when all our worst fears come. I can't do this, or it'll all be over, never will work, life will be tragic. It's almost like thinking about the very worst case scenario rather than what the best case could be. The middle one in there is, the middle bottom one is called a 30-second rush to action. It's do something quick, do anything to avoid sitting with that feeling of uncertainty any longer. And the last one on the corner is I called almost like resistance. This can be procrastination, not doing anything, a way to avoid almost as a way in a response to the unknown. Now, all of these are sometimes they run unconsciously, and you might have several, or sometimes we have a preference. We know that we tend to catastrophize, or we know we tend to analyze. And they're neither good nor bad. They all serve a purpose. They help us, but they can also harm us. So, for example, catastrophic thinking, there's the book, Only the Paranoid Survive. I might be building my bomb shelter, and I might be, buying all of these and preparing this, but the benefit is I'm prepared for the worst. But the cost is, 90% of the time, maybe the worst does not happen. And yet I've suffered the cost, the emotional toll and stress in preparation for it. The analysis and paralysis is good. I said it's useful, but again, the situation may have changed. 30-second rush to action is good because we should have a bias for action as leaders, as managers. But the cost is if we rush into something, it may be a quick fix that actually doesn't solve the underlying issue, but that actually may make the situation worse. So think for yourself, what is your default reaction when you face the unknown? And how does your default pattern serve and hinder you? And maybe you recognize another default reaction that wasn't on the list, and that's fine. How does that serve you? How does it cost you? So I ask you to enter that into the chat, just 1 minute. What's your default reaction? How does it serve you, or how does it cost you? You can just enter your default reaction if you want, and a word in how it serves you, word in how it costs you. Have a think. So the idea here is we're not trying to say these are good or bad. We're trying to bring awareness so we have more choice. So we're not just, for example, analyzing, or we're not only rushing into action or catastrophizing in our thinking, but that we have more choice. David, would you read out some of the responses in the chat?
Of course, we've got quite a few coming through. So people are saying fight, flight, or freeze, and a combination of these. Somebody else is saying they realize that they take quick action, but they realize the cost is that quick action leads to more mistakes. Someone else is saying it varies depending on my knowledge level of the situation and those that are impacted by my decisions. Slow down a little, think and analyze more. Prepare for the worst. Somebody else is saying fear. Someone else is saying gather information. Do the bits you can do, and more will be resolvable. And more will, if resolvable, fall into place. A lot of research and analysis, trying to stay positive and staying faithful. Someone else is saying they would find an expert. What's the worst that can happen? Are there simple ways to avoid that? Somebody else is saying research and analysis, talking things through with colleagues or peers. That's pretty much
that's interesting. So it's not just fight, flight, freeze. There's also connect. Most of their research on fight, flight, freeze was done on soldiers returning from the war. And they found that also connect, and particularly among women, was also a high response. So it's interesting that all of you have your own responses, and of course it would vary depending on the situation, severity, but it's worth exploring. What do you tend to do, and how might you experiment in doing something different and seeing how that might serve you? Now, in terms of not knowing, this was a subject that came to me when I was struggling, and I wrote a book on networking, and I wanted to write something that was meaningful to me, that combined psychology, philosophy, leadership, management, spirituality. And I didn't know, and I thought, that's it. It's not the same as uncertainty. It's a different feeling, this not knowing. So whenever you go into a business bookshelf, whatever, you'll see many books on uncertainty. But uncertainty is only one feeling in response to the unknown. So think about children at Christmas, and imagine a present that's wrapped up. Does the child, or let's say a birthday or Eid or Diwali, or envelope or another gift, do the child feel uncertain about what's in the gift? Not at all. They feel curious. They're full of wonder, full of possibility. So I became curious with my co-author, Deanna Renner, about who are the people that think about the unknown, not as a place of uncertainty, but as a space of opportunity and possibility. So we interviewed a range of people, from adventurers, artists, scientists, entrepreneurs. And what we discovered was that weren't adding more things to their toolbox, as it were, but it was around almost like taking away things. It was what Keats, the poet, called negative capability. And negative capability, he defined as the ability to be with mystery, uncertainty, and doubt, without interval reaching after fact and reason. And we came up with 4 negative capabilities that are practical, that can help us dealing with the unknown and to reframe our relationship with the unknown to one of possibility. So the first one is called empty your cup. And most of you are familiar with the traditional Zen story about the cup being full, so no more can be added. But I had the experience of this when I trained as a psychotherapist. I had a client who was depressed for several years, and I was only a trainee, and I felt I needed to know everything about depression from the DSM in order to help him. And my supervisor said to me, "What makes you think that your beginning is a disadvantage?" And he quoted for me a quote from Suzuki Senroshi, and it's this: "In the beginner's mind are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few." In the beginner's mind, there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind, there are few. So I began experimenting, trying new things in order to help this particular client get more peace from his own depression. The founder of Aikido, he died in his 80s, where it used to be. He reportedly asked to be buried in a white belt. So even though he was advanced and a master of his craft, he still had the mindset for beginner. What can I learn here? He didn't have the arrogance of, I've seen it all before, or I already know this. But always thinking like a beginner. And in business, when people have a mindset where there's no existing path dependencies, scale and rapid growth can happen much more quickly. So think about mobile banking in Africa or microfinance in India. They could grow because rapidly where there's no existing path dependencies, or we should do things this way because they've already been done that way. Mohammed Yunus, when he started the Grameen Bank, reportedly said, he thought about not knowing being a blessing, because every time he needed to know what to do, he'd look at what conventional banks did and he would do the opposite. They went to the rich, went to the poor, they went to men, he went to women owned by rich, he had Grameen owned by poor people. Says he could try, he had that flexibility because of that beginner's mindset. So to see that not knowing is something precious and open. One of the exercises I do with executives is I get them to think about a complex challenge. It could be the one that you've chosen today. And I give them about a minute to write down everything they know about their challenge on a piece of paper. And I ask them to fold it up, fold it in half again and put it into their pocket. Give them the same amount of time to think about all the questions and curiosities they have about that challenge. And again, fold it in half again. And then to hold the two almost in each hand outright, and to say which feels metaphorically the heavier, which is the lighter, which list was the shorter, which was the longer, which was the easier, which was the more difficult. And what's interesting is that often we struggle with this openness and curiosity, but we stick more with what we know. And the reason I say to keep what they know in their pocket is because we're not being disingenuous. We're not pretending to be the blank slate, the tabula rasa. We hold what we know, we keep what we know, but we hold it lightly, and we make space for what we don't know. We hold them both. And it's some important lesson to remember. Where are we tending to emphasize? Because often we can overemphasize what we don't know, and actually there are things that we know. So it's holding both in tension. I also think there's a value in curiosity and questions. As a child, if a child asked, more than 3 questions in school, in a class in a row, they're thought to have ADD, hyperactive, and they're given Ritalin. And as our adults, how often do we stop asking questions? So this ability to ask questions, this ability, I think, is fundamental to the beginner's mind. So how much can you experience being a beginner again? How might you apply this to your situation? So have a reflection in your journal. How might you experience this? It might be through, you can enter into chat if you want. It could be like, having reverse mentoring. Could be by teaching somebody something, because again, you need to learn it as if for the first time in order to teach that well. How might you be a beginner again? The second capability is close your eyes in order to see. It's from the artist Paul Gauguin. This is a picture, it's a portrait, and it's called Empathy. And you can see why it's empathy from the feet. But what's interesting is that the photographer, Mark Antonio, is visually impaired, is blind, and he takes photos by using his hands as aperture. And what this signifies, close your eyes in order to see, is that one of my friends says, the eyes are the fascias of the head. We tend to be too led by one particular sense. And in the same way, when we're in the unknown, we can be too led by one particular source of information, advice. So we tend to ask the same people, or we tend to read the same journals, or we tend to go to our default. So how can we open up our aperture? How can we notice much more and widen our perspectives? Simple example from about listening and listening more deeper. So University of Rochester Medical School did a study, and it showed that doctors interrupt their patients after an average of 23 seconds. And if they only listened for 6 more seconds, the patient would reveal something significant that would change the diagnosis. So how do we learn just to hold and to listen just a little bit longer, those 6 seconds, enabling us to discover new information that may help us solve and our complex challenge. So this is about what familiar sources can we close? How can we enable new ways of seeing to emerge? And how can we listen more deeply? The third capability was leap into the dark. There's a poem by Apollinaire, "Come to the edge," he said. They said, "We are afraid." "Come to the edge," he said. They came, he pushed them, and they flew. This is a photograph by Yves Klein, and he's in the photo. And Yves Klein, you can see, this is the days before Photoshop. He's got a smile on his face, and he's falling into a concrete street. Why is he smiling? He was a trained martial artist. He knew how to fall. So sometimes we only can work our way forward by taking action, not by thinking about, but by moving outwards into the world and by taking small steps, not necessarily huge ones. So one of the things that I am particularly scared of is heights. So I decided to trial this for myself, and I decided to try the flying trapeze. So there's a flying trapeze in London. If you imagine it's a 40-foot pole, and at the top is a little square. You stand on it, you have to reach out, and you can let go and fly through the air. Now, I was the only one, I think, and the rest adult, the rest were like 11-year-olds who were full of life and full of energy, joking, and I was really scared. And I remember we practiced on a low beam, which you practice safely. You don't do the big thing immediately. But there did come a point I had to climb the beam, stand on the top. And unless I let go, I'd be torn apart. So sometimes we choose change, we choose things, but often it can be imposed on us, but there's no choice. The caterpillar has no choice in becoming butterfly. These things, endings happen. So I remember doing the jump and letting go because it was too painful to hold on. Actually, it was impossible. And at the very top, when I had the least amount of support, I hooked my knees over and fell backwards. And this is also true in life. It's when we have the least support that we have the most potential for mobility. No, it's not the gymnast on the ground that's the most graceful. It's when she's in or he's in the air. Same with any other things. I remember when I was in a bank and we were going through an acquisition, and I was speaking to my mentor and I was saying how uncertain I feel. He says, "Sin, this is a wonderful time to be here because it's when things are always changing that you have the most potential for movement and progression, not when things are the same." So it's a powerful reframe for me. Now, one of the ways we can do this is by not having one solution, by generating multiple hypotheses and trying multiple experiments. So a company, Intuit, owned by Quicken, wanted to raise the income of rural farmers in India. They didn't have one solution. They tried, I think, up to 15-minute experiments before they found one that worked and raised income by 20%. The idea here is we don't have to do one grand experiment. We can try many micro experiments. I think it's David Weeks' author. He calls it Trojan mice. So rather than a Trojan horse, which is, big actions have bigger unintended consequences, try several small experiments which have smaller unintended consequences. And one of them might be the winning thing. I think I heard this morning one of the founders of EasyJet saying Stelos didn't want to create, massive change in different industries. He wanted to create 1% change, and those small change in many industries. So that 1% he felt would be disruptive enough that allowed him to found the first airline that didn't use travel agencies, though, but direct by consumers. So when you're thinking about your challenge, what multiple hypotheses could you generate regarding your situation? What might be some small experiments that you could try? And how might you benefit from taking a leap of faith? How might you practice with support? And the last one is delight in the unknown. The unknown can be a very difficult period in our lives. And it's not the time to be almost like putting more additional pressure on ourselves. Rather, it's the time to be almost more empathic and kinder to ourselves, and also to those that we lead and to those that we work with. Cleveland Hospital is one of the leading hospitals in the world. They had a challenge with how to increase empathy of patients with staff, but also with staff with patients, particularly given high uncertainty in a medical and hospital environment. So they decided to focus on empathy and kindness, and remembering that and remembering this quality when we're going through the unknown. So I'm going to show you a video as you watch it to see what it moves in you. And the question I have for you is, how can you be a bit more kinder and compassionate to yourself and to colleagues as you go through the unknown? So think about that as we watch this video. So it's a powerful video, I think you'll agree. And it just illustrates, as we're going through the unknown, how might we attend to ourselves and attend to others better. I remember when I was training as a coach and we were asked who are we going to be a possibility of being, all these grandiose type of things. And the trainer said, Stephen, can you bring it a bit more closer in, something a bit more specific? And I changed mine to my goal almost was to be a bit more kinder and compassionate to myself when I struggle. And I think that's what we really need in days of pandemic, days of uncertainty. It's not to beat ourselves up thinking we need to be perfect at all things. It's giving us the support and showing ourselves that as well. So the question I have then is, how might you show more support to yourself and your colleagues and clients when going through the unknown? And what is your self-care routine? And, we often hear about this thing, self-regulation, meaning how can you regulate your own emotions? But a large part of it is also co-regulation. It's this idea that we need others, we need the support of others in order to get through the unknown. It's not just self-regulation only. So end with a story from the Greek myths, because they teach us a lot about the unknown. And there's a particular story, a myth of Eros and Psyche, that you might know were lovers. And Psyche was separated from Eros, and she was given several tasks by the goddess Aphrodite. And if she completed them, she'd be reunited with Eros. They were impossible tasks, but through the help of nature, animals, etc., she managed to complete all of them till the last one, which was to get the perfume box of Persephone, who was the goddess of the underworld. But the only challenge here was nobody went into the underworld and came back. But she decided to take the challenge. She got the coin. She didn't give it to the beggar. Instead, she paid the ferryman to cross the river Styx into the underworld. She got past the ravenous dogs. She descended, and she got to Persephone, who was known for her beauty. And she asked Persephone, could I have the perfume box? And Persephone said yes, under one condition. And you know what the condition was, right? The condition was, you mustn't open the box. So Psyche, having the perfume box, could be reunited, started to ascend. And what did she do? She opened the box. And the myth says she fell unconscious, which is a euphemism for she died. And scholars debate what was in the box. And what they seem to agree on was in the box was knowledge of mortality. The reason Persephone was so beautiful, young, she didn't know death. She didn't have the knowledge. And the thing that the gods most envied was the ability of humans not to know, because they were omniscient. Every day was the same. Every day was known. There was no surprise. There was no wonder, no excitement, no joy, no possibility, no creativity. So while not knowing is a heavy burden to bear and our situations are difficult, there's also that gift, there's also the blessing, and there's also the grace of not knowing, which equally I hope that you've got some sense of in this short talk. So what have you learned about your relationship to not knowing today? What have you learned about your own default reaction at the edge, your relationship to expertise, beginner's mind, whether you're thinking about over-reliance on one particular source of information, ability to experiment? What was one action you could take to enhance your ability to be with the unknown, or one question that you might live with? Rilke, the poet, said, those questions are like unopened doors. You're not meant to solve them once, they're there to be lived with. Like we ask them over and again in our lives, and each time we get a deeper answer. So think about that as you reflect what your takeaway is from today. Summary pointers: recognize your own relationship to knowledge and expertise, develop your own capacity to be in not knowing, understand your default reaction at the edge, try to develop your own strategies and maybe experiment, try different responses, cultivate a mindset of exploration and experimentation, focus on questions and experiments. And lastly, as the video showed, be compassionate to yourself and give and receive support. So learned with a quote by a Spanish poet, Antonio Machado, this was Spanish, I'm sure you could say it much more beautifully in Spanish. But the essential thing is he's a traveler or pilgrim. There is no path. The path is made by walking. And this idea that in the unknown, there is no void that follow, but we're making it. And what I want to suggest is nobody does a Camino alone. You walk with others, and to recognize who are those people you're walking with, and to support and encourage and receive help as well along the way. Now, if you enjoyed this, do feel free to connect with me. I'm on LinkedIn, and this Not Knowing is the first of a trilogy of titles. David from Amber, who introduced, was the editor of this book. It won the Management Book of the Year in 2015 in the UK. And delighted to take questions now. And yeah, thank you so much for your time and your attention. And I'll hand back to David.
Thanks very much, Stephen. Thank you for that. Yes, as Stephen said, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat box or indeed the Q&A box, and we'll try and get through them for the last 10 minutes or so. So, Stephen, the first question we've got is, how do you deal with people who don't like it when questions are asked, and some trivialize questions, making the person asking the question look stupid? So in a world of not knowing, how do you deal with people who don't like not knowing or who don't like questions?
Yes, it's a tricky one. People who don't like questions. Yeah, it depends on the question and how it's posed, I think. Some people can feel directly attacked with questions like, for example, why questions, and they feel that's a personal attack. So one of the ways might be to make statements and check responses to statements. And that will be an alternative to asking a question. Yeah, how to deal with people get irritated, I really don't know. I think part of it is experimenting, trying different responses if that particular individual doesn't particularly like questions. One of the ways that I've tried to do things is not to challenge alone. So I've always had the advice, if you have an opinion and it's strong, maybe it's best if it's shared, so more than one person offers that as a suggestion. And if it's feedback, that person's more able to receive it, if it's not just coming from one individual, but coming from a few. But it is tricky. Sometimes I think I said, if we ask too many questions, it's seen as something like an attention deficit disorder, like we should be put on Ritalin and calm down. But actually asking powerful questions is really important. But again, let's not confuse this with volume, because it's not volume. It's not asking the 10 question necessarily, but it's the quality of the question. Some person, the most impactful interventions are often the shortest and the simplest. They're one sentence or one comment, and it leaves you, well, what was that? So it's maybe it's not about the machine gun of questions, but it's that one that addresses the heart of the issue. So I hope that's helpful. There is a book, I think it's by David Marquardt, Leading with Questions. That might be a helpful book, or giving some more ideas on how to deal with people who don't like to be questioned. The challenge is, it's called the Backfire Effect. When we try to convince people of our opinion, it backfires because they defend theirs and they become more entrenched actually in their view. So the question isn't to use question as a means to defend or argue, but try to make it safe to explore. We can tell when somebody's trying to question in order to score a point. It's not a genuine question. It's almost like preloaded. And we can tell when it's a genuine open question for exploration. So I'd say much more exploration of the question, the intent of the question, and looking for conciseness, for impact, and brevity.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. So our next question is around the pandemic. So they're really asking, has a pandemic made any changes on the acceptance of not knowing? So I suppose for context, it was something where we were all completely unprepared for. So in your experience over the past 2 years, do you feel that perhaps people's mindsets have changed a little bit towards, not being able to predict things and then, having to deal with them at very short notice and work forward from a position of not knowing?
Yeah, I think it's disruptive for us all. And if it was only temporary, we could have gone, recognized it as a blip and continued as before. But I think it has impacted most, if not all, of our lives. And it served as an opportunity. You often hear about the V, bouncing back to better. But I think it's other people have talked about it like a Y, where we're not just going back to different, but we're going down as well, the vertical axis. And literally why we're questioning our purpose, our identity, issues around who we are, why we're doing things. And this is really the topic of the last book of the trilogy, Not Being, because I think we're questioning fundamental assumptions about what makes us happy, what will bring fulfillment. We're looking at our relationship with the environment. We're looking at all these factors. So I think the answer is yes, for most of us. It's given us enough of a disruption that we can't continue as before, at least not in the same way, and that we had to question things that have long been the case, and maybe that will continue into the future.
Thank you, Stephen. Okay, somebody else has asked the question, if you can provide an example of a business which has had to pivot or change its trajectory during turbulence with notable success. And for reference, the person asking the question has said that they work in the healthcare sector.
So there are many transformations, and companies that survive long tenure tend to change radically. Like I think IBM, for example, was in the weights and scales business when it first started, and then went to clocks and timing and hardware to software to consulting, now to cloud and infrastructure. But another example in difficult times, is the Financial Times, the newspaper, was heavily reliant on print and advertising, onslaught of internet, dramatic reduction in advertising in print. And it was a do or die situation. So they had to almost reinvent themselves on the S-curve. So as things were declining, they had to almost grow in parallel an additional business, which was growing their digital business. But it's an example of how not knowing is an opportunity also for reinvention and for thinking. But it doesn't happen in companies so quickly, and often culture and change take a lot longer than just simply shifting to a new product. And most companies have to manage a dual transformation that happens over a period of time, and to be successful in doing that shift. So those are the kind of things I would look at, dual transformation examples. I think there is a book called Dual Transformation I recommend, that looks at different companies and how they pivoted in disruption and how they've had to reinvent their business model. But often, we tend to think of transitions as quick, and often they can be very slow. And in terms of organizational culture, the late Gareth Jones, who wrote the book, Why Should Anyone Be Led By You? He talked about culture taking a generation to change, like 40 years to change. It's not like a culture project we can change in a year, how people operate and think and enact with each other. So it takes longer. Research on Transitions, there's a great book by a guy called Bruce Feiler, who wrote a book called Life is in the Transitions. He talks about this thing. He says all change begins with endings, but they're never quick endings. He calls them the long goodbye. We tend to go through a long goodbye, a messy middle, before a new beginning. And often we're tempted to think we can just skip the messy middle, or we can just, hasten the ending. But there's always that process to go through, and every industry, every company will be different. But most companies I know go through a dual transformation, managing their core business and their decline while growing the new business.
Thank you, Stephen. I think we've got time for one more question, if that's okay. This person is saying, thank you very much for an insightful session. Would you be able to give some advice on a technique for writing a leadership reflection? They're saying they've never had to do this before, and they're finding it hard to write this down, emphasizing their own emotions and feelings at the same time.
Yeah, what I've been doing, I can share my viewpoint, is I've been learning to keep a journal, or keeping a journal, since I was around 18. And I don't write in it every day, but it's a practice. Often, when people do diaries, they write events and they write, on this day I did X, Y, Z. And yet the challenge is to go beyond the events, to share the emotions and the feelings and what led you. So I think it does come with practice. It's not something I've done overnight. I've kept journals for decades now. But one of the things that might help is almost to think about the critical incidences, like not write generally, but think about 3 or 4 instances that moved you or influenced you. And Gertz is from anthropology, called it thick description. Try to not just write about events, but what was the feelings, what were the senses, what were the around it. So what I would suggest is, if you look at the field of anthropology, that may help. Look at the idea of thick description, which is much more richer than just transactional information. And think about key moments, because often those key pivotal points are much more full of emotion than perhaps trying to think abstractly about what is your leadership philosophy, etc. So what were the key things or moments that shaped you? And that makes it a little bit easier. I hope that would help.
Thank you, Stephen. Well, I'm afraid that is all we've got time for today. But thank you so much once again for such an insightful and very practical approach to not knowing. And thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us all today and share your insight on the topic. I certainly very much enjoyed it, and I hope everyone did as well. Just to remind everyone that we will be sending the recording to you within about a week. So if you missed anything, you'll be able to refresh your memories when you see that. And Stephen's very kindly put his own details on the screen if you want to follow up with him or catch up about any of the topics discussed today. So all that remains for me to say is, once again...
Sorry, David. The best thing is if you can connect with me on LinkedIn, that would be the best way to connect. And I'll be happy to connect with anyone who's been on this webinar today.
Perfect. Thank you. Well, yeah, all that remains for me to say is, once again, thank you very, very much, Stephen. And thank you everyone for taking part. And we'll see you again at the next webinar. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. And thanks, David.